again, I just want to say good afternoon, share greetings, and then thank the conference organizers for inviting me to come and share some perspectives with you all today. So again, let's move on to our discussion about charging up mobility equitably. So being that I am a former medical school professor and researcher and educator, I have to start with my learning objectives so that you all know which direction that we're headed this afternoon. So what we will cover today are these 3 bullet points, so that will allow you to have a sense of which direction that we're going to be going today. All right. So as Joyce shared, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, I'm one of the co-founders and managing partners of EV Noir. Some of you may know my colleague, fellow co-founder, managing partner, Terry Travis. And so for those who are not familiar with our organization, EV Noir is a technology mobility consulting group. We focus on work in the electric, connected, and shared and autonomous vehicle solution space. However, we do focus on 2 core areas of work. It's e-mobility best practice and an e-mobility diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so our mission is to accelerate EV adoption, multimodal EV adoption, and new mobility options in a way that's equitable so that all communities really can benefit from this groundbreaking technology. Also, we have a sister organization that we co-founded, that's EV Hybrid Noir. Some of you may know about our work around EV Hybrid Noir as well. And so we're also the co-founders. And EV Noir is the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts. So for those that say that they don't know any diverse people that drive EVs and that diverse people don't need EVs, there is a community of thousands of diverse EV drivers who drive everything from a Ford Mach-E, a Fiat 500, first-gen Leaf, to the Porsche Taycan. So our members skew across the United States. You can see here, those are our predominantly larger chapters. We have everyone from folks in the inner city to rural communities. And so we call our group, it's a community so that we can share best practice, we can share technology and information, but it's also a living focus group because we're better able to understand what people are experiencing around electrification, both in terms of challenges and successes. So moving beyond that, diversity to us in this lens means more than just how people look. So it means being able to provide solutions and options for LGBTQ+ communities, retirees, women, rural communities, as well as native tribal communities, and much, much more. EV Hybrid Noir is also one of the 4 national partners of the National Drive Electric Week, and then also Drive Electric Earth Day, so that's coming up very soon. We're working in collaboration with the Sierra Club, Plug-in America, as well as the Electric Vehicle Association. And then we're founding members of GEVA, which is the Global EV Alliance, which is made up of about 40+ electric vehicle advocacy associations from around the globe, working collectively to advance best practice, policy, and electrification. So in thinking and doing this work, it's really important to our organizations to have team members and hire people who are reflective of the United States and of the different communities that we work in. So here you have a sample of our team and then a sample of some of the partners that we are collaborating with. So working in everything from electrification, OEMs, infrastructure, working with cities, the feds, as well as consulting organizations, utilities, and much, much more, probably many of these organizations that you all represent. So getting right into our discussion about mobility, for us, mobility means getting it's not just getting from point A to point B. It means so much more. And the sense is that really mobility and having access to transportation is really one of the leading financial and physical opportunities for communities. In our work, we believe that you can't talk about new mobility, particularly e-mobility and transportation, without recognizing the impact of past historic and systemic inequities and how they are showing up and currently impacting communities and transportation models. So here are some of the key issues and facts that we know are informing transportation and mobility solutions today. So first, let's start with the historic and systemic factors So we talk a lot about environmental justice, we talk about gentrification. One of the leading issues around transportation and mobility is redlining. And so that was a practice that was started with the Federal Housing Administration, where they denied loans to different communities. So they denied loans to members from African American and Black communities, Jewish communities, and more, and deemed their communities not worthy of investment. And so then there were other issues around displacement. So displacement was a practice, which I'll talk about shortly, where the federal highway infrastructure system, it was great that it built out and connected the United States, but it also did that at the disadvantage of many communities. Another challenge that we face around mobility is spatial mismatch and transportation burden. So from our research, we found that public transportation in many cases in many cities doesn't adequately meet people's need in terms of providing safe and reliable transportation options. And this has been apparently clear during the COVID pandemic. Spatial mismatch is a phenomenon where you have individuals who considered essential workers and may represent underserved communities. They are experiencing labor challenges because the jobs don't reside in communities where they live. So in terms of thinking about electrification, autonomous vehicle, and transit, there's so many opportunities in this space. One, public health. Public health is a critical piece of this conversation, which sometimes we don't focus on enough, but it is something that, is a significant piece of this work. So obviously transitioning away from fossil fuel vehicles is going to help improve communities' health and well-being. In addition, you have the need for transit. So thinking about transitioning to shared transportation, connected AV, you're going to reduce traffic fatalities. And many of these communities that we're talking about that are vulnerable, considered frontline, are one of the populations that are most impacted by traffic fatalities. Also, of course, you have the opportunity to reduce congestion as well as many other aspects looking at economics. You have many more affordable options in terms of cost savings for transitioning fleets. And you also will have a lot of ancillary employment opportunities due to the emerging companies and the emerging technologies that go hand in hand with transitioning to electrification. So I want to just take a moment to talk briefly about some of the destructive transportation policies that I alluded to in the last slide. And of course, since we're in Austin, Texas, I wanted to try to make these examples relevant to Austin. And so just to give you a quick background, so Plessy versus Ferguson was one of the Supreme Court landmark decisions that we all learned about in middle school and probably high school. And so that was the law of the land that said separate but equal was going to be the law of the land. So the races could be separate as long as they both had equal access or their facilities looked the same. But of course, that wasn't what happened. And so from Plessy versus Ferguson, we move into 1917, where there was another Supreme Court ruling. It was the Buchanan decision, and that struck down the segregated zoning laws. And so this was a huge victory against racial segregation. However, what resulted in the southern states was that they found other ways to alienate minority communities. And so specifically in Austin, what city planners did here was that they decided to create certain districts. So that one of the districts was called the Negro District. And so that was the only community that Negro, at the time, that was what they were called. African Americans today, Black Americans, because they could only live in this one section of the city, so that was the only place they could go for services, for school, et cetera. And so if you look at the map for 1928, you'll see that the district, there's a red line that was Eastern Avenue, which later became I-35, which splits the city east and west. East of the city is where predominantly minority communities live. So you can see there's red highlights and yellow and blue. So the red marks are where redlining, or I talked about the disinvestment, and individuals who were living in those communities that may have been African American or Hispanic or other ethnic groups, they were not allowed to they were not able to purchase homes because they were not granted loans and financing to be able to do so. So even you wonder, like, okay, why am I talking about this history? That was such a long time ago. Well, those decisions and those policies impact the transportation and mobility landscape today. If you look at the impact of COVID, you can see that from the map, if you overlaid this COVID map with the Austin redlining map, East Austin was the community that had the highest rates of COVID, highest mortality rates or death rates, and also had the lowest vaccine rates. So it is all interconnected, and we have to think about this historical and the social context when we're thinking about policies around electrification, as well as thinking about pilots, as well as engaging communities. So what we know is that environmental racism is nothing new, and it's embedded into this transportation discussion. And so there are ways to address this, which we'll talk about as we move through this presentation. But I want to point out that today, like, zip code is the most significant predictor of one's health and well-being. It also predicts where you're likely to live. So regardless of socioeconomic status, 70% of African Americans are living in communities where they're overexposed to pollution. The last slide at the bottom is just a really fascinating study that was done by the University of Minnesota that just shows, like, who's producing more pollution and who's exposed to it. And so just in summary, before we move into the next area of our discussion, is that here are the reasons why equity, diversity, and inclusion are really important to accelerating transportation or accelerating electrification, particularly in today's conversation. So we've had this history of systemic and historical inequities. We've also had lack of representation. So, for instance, lack of representation in the decision makers who are informing the policies, informing what the pilots look like, as well as informing what the marketing and engagement strategy looks like. Also, we have to think about having culturally relevant marketing. So it's really all tied together, because what we always say in the work is that the one-size-fits-all approach really is not best practice. It doesn't work, and we shouldn't continue to push these models that are based on destructive paradigms. Also, another challenge that we face in working in this space is lack of trust between communities for whether it's the different sectors that we represent, government, utilities, etc. So there's opportunities to do our work differently so that we can begin to build relationship and build trust and move this conversation forward. So all of these different challenges lead up to lack of EV adoption in diverse communities, gaps in ownership, gaps in rural adoption as well. So let's talk a little bit more about why equity and e-mobility can really make a huge impact. So we talked about the public health significance here in Texas. Texas has is the leading contributor to transportation-related emissions in the United States. And so we know as a broad statistic that transportation emissions accounts for about 30% of all the greenhouse gases in the United States. So one of the things, obviously, there's the opportunity to transition away from fossil fuel vehicles and utilize electrification as this strategy to mitigate this issue. One of the reasons why this is important is because vulnerable and frontline communities bear the brunt of transportation emissions through exposure to respiratory illnesses, asthma rates, higher death rates as a result of exposure to transportation emissions. So we really have to do things differently. And what I often say is, like, for some communities, transitioning to multimodal electric vehicles or electrification is cool technology, but for other communities, it's really a matter of life and death. Moving on to just environmental well-being here, you can see here that by making this transition, we can really significantly reduce our carbon footprint. And then obviously there's opportunities for economic development, entrepreneurship, opportunities for workforce and more jobs. So for instance, The Economist recently found that as we transition to electrification, over the next 25 years, we have the opportunity, reduce my statistics, over the next 15 years, we have the opportunity to have 25 million jobs that are related to electrification. So this could be a very huge, significant game changer for many families and for many communities. So here's where we are today in terms of where we sit in the ecosystem. So obviously there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of excitement and policies that are moving electrification forward. So one of those is the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was passed last fall. It creates a lot of different opportunities to accelerate electrification, as well as really address some of our infrastructure challenges and infrastructure weaknesses. So here's a whole host of different opportunities that we can utilize with this funding. So what I want to focus on, of course, is the funding that relates to electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So in regards to this funding mechanism, so we have the opportunity for all 50 states to help build out their transportation, electrification, charging infrastructure. And so as part of this task or charge, the states will need to put together work plans working in tandem with the new joint office between Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation to put their plans together to really show how they're planning to really build out this ecosystem and address a lot of the charging gaps and the charging deserts. And so part of this requires that these 3 bullet points be met. And I think the third one is really significantly important because there's an opportunity to really get feedback from the different key stakeholders that are impacted by transportation electrification. So there's money allocated for that, and that's what states should really be utilizing and building that into their proposals. However, one of the things that states need to consider as we've been talking with DOE and DOT is that they want to hear from states before August 1st when these plans are due. So if you're not already talking to your state DOT or talking to the joint office and you're working on your state's plan, you should definitely make this a high priority because they really want to be able to provide counsel and provide technical assistance to help the states inform their plans. And they want to see this intentional focus on community outreach and engagement, not just in the plan, but also now to see how you're getting feedback from community partners, from different stakeholders to inform your strategy. So the other issue why equity is important in this conversation is that based on our research, as well as others who have been working in this space, we find that African American and Latinx, Latino, Latina communities, Hispanic communities have the highest propensity for EV adoption. Consumer Reports has shown this in their last study that they did a couple years ago. We're currently working on another study with Consumer Reports and a couple other organizations, Green Latinos, Union of Concerned Scientists, looking at this same issue, but with a larger representative national sample. And so what we know is that the United States is getting more and more diverse. And African American and Hispanic communities spend trillions of dollars, as you can see here. And so if your entity or organization, whether you're an OEM or charging infrastructure or other, if you don't have a vertical marketing strategy around multicultural spending, you're going to really, as they say, the train is going to leave the depot or leave the station, or maybe the electric bus is going to leave the depot. But you really have to lean into thinking about with this buying power, what does that mean for the products or the services that my organization is producing or seeking to accelerate through electrification. So that's a critically important issue that we need to definitely lean into. Also, another thing that just kind of tying in how we work in this space is that our team is currently working with the 25 largest cities around their decarbonization strategies as well as electrification strategies. And so what we're seeing is that cities and states are, grappling with, are we going to do, focus on driver network delivery, electrification? Are we focusing on ride share, creating new hubs, charging infrastructure siting, transit electrification, port electrification? How are we all, embedding all of these different sectors? And so really it's critical to think about the strategy that you want to implement for all of those efforts, because all of those efforts are critical, particularly the medium and heavy duty electrification cases. And so, of course, we would be remiss without thinking about how we want to accelerate electrification in rural and agricultural communities. This technology is also for them, and we've been working with agricultural communities on pilots and thinking about rideshare as well. And so there's definitely, I'm really excited to see new electric vehicles coming out that will cater to some of the needs of these particular audiences. So a lot of our partners that are working in rural and agricultural communities are really excited about the new pickup trucks that are coming that will definitely fill a void in their communities, as well as in other instances where they can contribute to fleet electrification. So there's really a lot of excitement around the new vehicle offerings that are coming to market. Of course, then we have medium heavy duty electrification, which is, probably a focal point of many of your entities' work right now. And so there's definitely opportunities to lean in here and utilize best practice to spur the transition to medium heavy duty electrification. So just thinking a few things to take home and take back with you as we're talking about electrification and equity in practice. The idea is that why do you want to engage with communities and partners and decision makers who are, impacted worse than first by this conversation? Well, it's critically important because those who are closest to the problem often have a pretty good idea of what are the potential solutions, strategies, and opportunities that can help move this conversation forward. There's also, obviously, we have to think about how do we want to engage with these different communities and different consumers. I hear often that communities and stakeholders, utilities, whomever it is, they want to know how can we get buy-in from partners? How do we build bridges? We may not have had the best relationships with community partners. Well, part of it is listening, getting a better understanding of the causes of the challenges or the barriers, getting a better understanding of the historical and contextual challenges that impact or are informing how people show up and utilize transportation and mobility, understanding like how the data informs how people use transportation. Also, another question that we hear and we see is that how do organizations positively change outcomes for communities? Well, communities don't need you to do anything for them, but they will want, it is the best practice and the idea is to work hand in hand with community partners. So engaging with communities to advocate and legislate and design programs. So it's not that you want to do something to communities, it's all about really meeting communities where they are. And sometimes that means that your organization isn't showing up. You have to have an intermediary kind of bring you in and vouch for the your entity and then vouch for your your role and your interest in addressing and working with community partners in a way that's mutually beneficial to both. And I will also say one of the things that we've learned over time is a couple things. So when we're seeking to gain information from communities or just work with them, it's really important to respect community partners, decision makers' time and effort. So we compensate them just as if somebody was asking me to provide some technical assistance or consulting work on a project. So we provide remuneration for their time, for their expertise. And the idea is that, it's not a one-time relationship. It's not a one-night stand, as some will say. It's a long-term relationship that you want to build with community partners. So keeping that in mind as you engage with community partners is really critical. And then sometimes you have to work with a third party that's an external entity that can work on your behalf to represent kind of a neutral party so that it's there's almost like a mediator or moderator that is working on your behalf and working to collaborate with community partners and key stakeholders. So just thinking about some of the different perspectives that may be represented in this room today, here are some things that you can think about and kind of mill over as you're at the happy hour line and talking with your colleagues. So here are some different ways that utilities can show up in the conversation, having a framework where you're getting landscape assessment type data. So you're getting information from your consumer base in terms of what are their attitudes, what are the opportunities, what are some of the challenges that they're facing. auto manufacturers, charging infrastructure, and network companies, more inclusive marketing. So sometimes I've worked on projects recently and the marketing material has not been diverse. And so I send them an email or send them a note like, hey, let's add some diverse hands holding the charger or standing next to the car. So let's add, people who are all different age ranges. Maybe we need to, think about that as we're thinking about our marketing and outreach approach. So if I don't see myself utilizing the technology, if I don't see myself up here on the stage speaking, I won't think I can do that. Or I don't think that technology is for me. And this is what we're hearing directly from our EV Hybrid Noir membership base, as well as from the studies that we've done across the country. So also, there needs to be support for individuals as they adopt this new technology. Because although all of us may be EV drivers or enthusiasts, and we're utilizing the technology and we're talking about it at happy hour and conferences like ETS, those of individuals who we may be working with and are hoping to convince to adopt electrification, they're not steeped in this conversation the way we are. They don't know that there's this huge transportation paradigm happening right before their eyes. So it's really important to create a sense of community and have educational resources and support so that this transition for them can be sustained. And then also in thinking about cities and states, working alongside the joint office, as I shared, is going to be critically important as you're planning your transportation, your charging infrastructure strategy. There's additional discretionary monies that's going to be available that we don't know all the guidance on yet, but we do know that we have the guidance for the NEVI funding, so that's definitely what we should be focused and honing in on currently. And again, all throughout these different sectors, there may be some that are not represented here today, but it's really important to be thinking about how we integrate equity and not just sprinkle a little bit of equity at the end or reaching out to an organization that we think can sprinkle equity in there, but that's not even what they do. They just have, Black and brown or vulnerable communities as part of their scope of work. It's really important to work with organizations that have a certain level of subject matter expertise and have a track record in addressing e-mobility, diversity, equity, inclusion strategies. So in closing, my last couple of points would be that I have to plug our conference because that wouldn't be right if I didn't, and I have your attention to do so. So every year we do this National E-Mobility, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion virtual conference. Many of you may have participated, or even I know some of you in the room have spoken at this conference. And so it'll be held October 13th and 14th this year, and we're really excited about bringing another iteration of this conference to our stakeholders. And then, of course, if you've enjoyed hearing about this perspective, the work that we do, and how we're approaching multimodal electrification from this lens, we're hiring. So we have a number of different positions on our team. So definitely please reach out to me or reach out to join our team for more information. And just thank you for the opportunity to have your attention, particularly when I know there's drinks and all kinds of goodies outside that we all want to enjoy. But thank you for your attention. I look forward to hearing, questions, whether or not I think I have to get off the stage, but I'll be around. I don't want them to pull the cane out on me, but please follow me on LinkedIn as well. I'm under Dr. EV Shelley, and I appreciate all the things that you all are doing in the space to really move this new mobility forward for all communities. So thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much.